The morning I came home and found the locks changed on my own house. There was a casserole dish sitting on the front porch. It had a dish towel over it, still warm, and a note tucked underneath written in my mother's handwriting. It said, "We made your favorite. There's a room ready for you at the Comfort Inn on Route 9. We paid for 2 weeks. Please don't make this harder than it has to be." I stood on that porch in October with my keys in my hand that no longer opened anything, with my mother's casserole going cold in the morning air, and I read that note 3 times, and each time I read it, I understood something new. The first read, they had planned this. The second read, they had planned this for a long time. The third read, the casserole was the part that broke me, not the locks, not the note. The casserole, because it meant my mother had stood in a kitchen somewhere that morning and cooked my favorite meal and put a dish towel over it and driven it to the house she had just taken from me. And she had done all of that and still believed with her whole heart that this was an act of love. My name is Danielle Pruitt. I'm 39 years old. I live in a house in Raleigh, North Carolina, that I purchased 18 months ago with a down payment that came from a settlement, and I will explain all of that. I have a life now that is genuinely, specifically mine, built from scratch, built correctly, built in a way that no one can touch, and it took everything I had to get here. But before I tell you how it ended, I need to take you back to where it started. Because this story is not just about a house. It is about what happens when the people who are supposed to protect you convince themselves that protecting their idea of you is the same thing. If you are new here, welcome to the Revenge Diaries. Subscribe and hit that like button if you enjoy stories about real people, real betrayal, and the long road to something that actually feels like justice. And tell me, where are you watching from right now? Drop your city or state in the comments below. I love knowing where this community is spread out. Let me go back. My parents, Thomas and Elaine Pruitt, are people who grew up without much and who, because of that, attached enormous emotional significance to the idea of property. They worked hard their entire lives, paid off their own house, and viewed home ownership as the clearest possible measure of a life built correctly. My father drove a delivery truck for 31 years. My mother worked as a school secretary until she retired. They were not complicated people. They were people who had a clear picture of how a good life was supposed to look, and they had organized their entire existence around achieving and maintaining that picture. I am the older of 2 sons. My brother Nathan is 4 years younger than me. Nathan and I are different in ways that became more consequential as we got older. I was quieter, more internal, more comfortable with uncertainty. I worked in graphic design, freelanced for a while, eventually built a small but stable client base and a career that looked unconventional from the outside but was, in practice, completely financially functional. Nathan was louder, more social, better at the specific performance of family life that our parents responded to. He called more often. He came home from our holidays. He married young, a woman named Cassie, whom my mother adored, and they had a child quickly, and they built the visible, legible version of a life that my parents could point to and feel proud of in a specific and immediate way. Nathan also had a pattern with money that everyone in the family had noticed and no one discussed directly. He borrowed. Not dramatically, not criminally, but consistently, small amounts that added up. Favors that were understood to be loans but were never repaid. Situations where his parents quietly absorbed costs that technically belonged to him. My parents never seemed to mind. Or rather, they minded in the private, invisible way that parents sometimes mind things they love their children too much to confront. The house on Callaway Street in Greensboro had been in the family since my grandmother purchased it in the early 80s. When she passed, she left it jointly to my parents with the understanding, stated in her will, that it would eventually go to one of her grandchildren. My parents moved in when they sold their own property and downsized. And then, About 3 years before everything happened, my father's health began to decline. A series of cardiovascular events, increasing difficulty getting around, the specific and accelerating fragility of a man in his early 70s who had worked physically his whole life. My parents made the decision to move into an assisted living facility that was closer to Nathan and Cassie. They asked me if I would move into the Calloway Street house to keep it maintained. I said yes. I moved my life to Greensboro. I paid the utilities. I handled every repair, every maintenance call, every property tax question. I treated it as my home because I had been invited to treat it as my home, and because I had given up an apartment in Charlotte and a life I had built there in order to be present and useful in the way my family needed. I lived on Calloway Street for 2.5 years. I repainted the exterior. I replaced the back fence when it came down in a storm. I had the roof assessed and coordinated the repair. I had the whole interior repainted, the carpets cleaned, the kitchen updated with appliances that actually worked. I spent time and money and presence on that house in the same way you spend those things on something that belongs to you, because I believed, because I had been told, that it would eventually belong to me, not in writing. That was the part I did not think about carefully enough. My parents had said more than once that Calloway Street was going to be Daniel's. They said it at Thanksgiving the first year I moved in. My father said it specifically, clearly, with both of us in the room, and I believed him, because he was my father, and because I did not understand yet what was happening in the conversations I was not part of. Nathan's situation had been deteriorating for a while before I found out the specifics. He and Cassie had bought a house that stretched their finances beyond what the circumstances actually supported. Nathan's income had been inconsistent for 2 years, a business venture that had not worked the way he planned, followed by a period of contract work that did not cover the gap. My parents had been quietly supplementing them, and at some point in those quiet conversations, in phone calls I was not on, and visits I was not part of, a different arrangement had been decided. The first sign I had that something was wrong was a phone call from my father in August. He was more formal than usual, more careful with his words and the way people are when they are reading from something, rather than speaking freely. He said that they had been giving a lot of thought to the property situation, and that they wanted to make sure everything was handled correctly and fairly, and that they had spoken with an attorney. I said, "Okay, Dad, what does that mean?" He said, "It means we want to talk to you in person. Can you come this weekend?" I said yes. I went. The conversation at the assisted living facility was the most surreal 40 minutes of my life to that point. My mother had arranged a small table in the common room. There was coffee. She had brought cookies from the bakery near their old house, the kind with the icing flowers. The kind she always brought to serious conversations, as if the sugar would soften what the words were doing. My father sat across from me, and my mother sat beside him, and he told me, in his careful way, that they had decided to transfer the Calloway Street property to Nathan. That Nathan and Cassie were in a difficult position and needed stability. That they knew I was capable and independent and would understand. That they were going to pay for 2 weeks at the Comfort Inn while I found alternative arrangements. That they had already changed the locks. I looked at my father. I looked at my mother with her icing flower cookies. I said, "You already changed the locks." My father said, "We thought it would be cleaner this way." My mother said, "You'll be okay, Daniel. You always land on your feet." And I understood in that moment, with the clarity of something that has been assembling in the background for a long time, finally arriving fully formed, that "you always land on your feet" had been their permission slip for this, the same way that "you're responsible, you'll figure it out" is always someone else's permission slip to take from the person they trust most to survive it. I did not cry in that common room. I thanked them for the coffee and the cookies. I do not know why I thanked them. I did not plan to. It was just the habit of 35 years, and I drove back to the house on Callaway Street, and I sat in the car in the driveway, and I looked at the front door with its new lock and the casserole on the porch, and I made a decision. Not about revenge. I was not thinking about revenge. I was thinking about documentation. I was thinking about the 2.5 years I had spent on this property and what that represented and whether any of it was provable. I was thinking like someone who suddenly understands that the story of what happened and the legal record of what happened are two different things, and that the gap between them is where your life either holds together or falls apart. I checked into the Comfort Inn. I used the 2 weeks to do 3 things. I called an attorney. I gathered every document I could find. And I called my friend Vanessa, who I had known since college and who is one of the most practically intelligent people I have ever met. And I told her everything. Vanessa said, "Daniel, you have receipts?" I said, "I have everything. Every repair, every contractor, every utility payment, every appliance purchase." "I paid for all of it," Vanessa said. "Then you are not as powerless as they think you are." The attorney's name was Patricia Asai. She was based in Greensboro, had 20 years of experience in property and estate law, and had the specific quality of listening that makes you understand within the first 10 minutes that this person is actually going to help you. I laid everything out for her: the conversations, the implied promises, the 2.5 years of documented investment, the receipts, the bank statements showing every utility payment, every contractor invoice I had paid. Patricia listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she said, "The implied promise element is difficult to prove as a standalone legal claim, but the financial investment is a different question. Tell me again about the improvements." And I told her. And she wrote things down in the careful, specific way of someone building something. And then she said, "There may be a legal basis for claiming unjust enrichment. It is not a simple path, but it is a real one. And I think it is worth pursuing." Now, here is where I want to stop and ask you something. If you had been sitting across from Patricia Asay, with everything I just described laid out on the table, the implied promises, the 2 years of payments, the receipts, the locks already changed, what would you have done? Would you have pursued it legally? Would you have walked away? Would you have handled it differently from the beginning? I genuinely want to know. Drop your answer in the comments, because the decision I made next was one I thought about for a long time, and I know it was not the only possible decision. Patricia filed a civil claim on my behalf. The legal basis was unjust enrichment, the principle that Nathan and my parents were receiving the benefit of 2.5 years of financial investment in the property without compensating me for it, and that allowing them to retain that benefit without compensation would be unjust. The specific amount Patricia put forward was calculated from every documented expense I had paid: utilities, repairs, improvements, appliances. The roof repair alone was significant. The exterior painting was significant. 2.5 years of utility bills were significant. The total was more than either my parents or Nathan had anticipated, because they had never added it up the way Patricia added it up. Nathan hired an attorney. My parents, after some initial resistance that I think was more emotional than strategic, eventually did not contest the underlying facts, because the underlying facts were documented completely and were not contestable. What they contested was the interpretation. Their attorney argued that I had been a guest in the property and that improvements made by a guest do not create financial obligation on the part of the owner. Patricia argued that the specific circumstances, the explicit invitation, the implied promise of eventual ownership, the duration and extent of the investment, distinguished this situation meaningfully from the standard guest arrangement. The case went through several months of negotiation. There were uncomfortable conversations. There was a period where my mother stopped returning my calls entirely, which was its own kind of grief. There was a mediation session at a conference table where Nathan and I sat across from each other for the first time since all of this became official, and Nathan looked at me with an expression I had not expected. He did not look angry. He looked ashamed, and I think that expression told me more about what he actually understood than anything he said in that room. The settlement was reached 4 months after Patricia filed. The specific terms I will keep general, as Patricia advised, but the outcome was this. I received a financial settlement that represented a fair reimbursement for the documented expenses I paid, plus additional compensation for the implied promise that had structured my decision to move to Greensboro and invest in the property in the first place. The settlement was meaningful. It was not everything I might have asked for in a perfect world, but it was real, and it was documented, and it closed the matter cleanly. I used part of the settlement for the down payment on my house in Raleigh. Patricia was at the closing with me. Vanessa was there. I signed my name on documents that made something mine, actually legally, permanently mine, for the first time in my adult life. And I sat in that empty house afterward with takeout from a Thai place nearby in Fletcher. I have a dog, a rescue mutt named Fletcher, who had been staying with Vanessa during the hotel weeks, and who ran through every room of the new house with the specific joy of an animal encountering new smells. And I felt something that I want to describe as accurately as I can. It was not triumph. It was not vindication exactly, though there was some of that. It was something closer to solidity. The specific feeling of a floor beneath your feet that belongs to you, that no one can change the locks on, that no casserole on a porch can make okay. My relationship with my parents now is something I am still working out. My father's health has continued to decline, and I see him periodically. There is love there. I do not want to pretend otherwise, and I think pretending otherwise would be dishonest in a way that does not serve anyone. But there is also something that has changed permanently, something that cannot be unchanged. My mother and I speak occasionally. The conversations are careful in the way of people navigating a landscape where one wrong step lands on something buried. She has not fully acknowledged what was done. She has circled it, come close, retreated. I have decided not to wait for a full accounting. Not because I do not think I deserve one, I do, but because waiting for it gives it power over my present that I am no longer willing to surrender. Nathan and I do not speak. I do not say that with satisfaction because I genuinely do not feel satisfaction about it. I feel something more like the specific sadness of a thing that could have been different and was not. Nathan is my brother. We grew up together. We have the same parents and the same grandmother's house in the background of our childhood, and the same memories of Thanksgiving tables and summer road trips and all the ordinary fabric of a shared life. What he did, or rather, what he allowed to happen without stopping it, cost us something that I do not think either of us will fully recover. And I carry that loss. I carry it without bitterness most days. But I carry it. Here's what I want to leave you with. If you're in a family situation right now where you have been told, explicitly or implicitly, that your capability is a reason to take from you, that your ability to handle things means you can be the one things are done to, I want you to hear something clearly. Documentation is protection. The distance between an implied promise and a legal record is the distance between having something and being able to prove you have it. Not because the people around you are necessarily planning to betray you, but because life is unpredictable and people under pressure make decisions they would not otherwise make. And the best protection you have is a clear record of your own investment in your own life. I learned this the hard way on a porch in October with a casserole going cold and keys that no longer opened the door they were supposed to open. And I am telling you this not to make you paranoid or suspicious of the people you love, but to give you the specific, practical understanding that protecting yourself is not an act of distrust, it is an act of self-respect. It is saying quietly and clearly that what you build and what you invest and what you give deserve to be taken seriously. And if anyone ever suggests otherwise, if anyone ever implies that your capability is permission to overlook what you are owed, you now know what to do. And one more thing, because I promised you a complete story. The Callaway Street house sold 8 months after the settlement. Nathan and Cassie, facing the same financial pressures that had driven the whole situation in the first place, were unable to sustain it. The house that my parents had transferred to them, the house they had taken from me so that Nathan could have stability, was listed and sold. The house I grew up visiting, that my grandmother had owned, that I had repainted and re-roofed and kept alive for 2.5 years, passed out of the family entirely. And my parents, watching it go, understood something that I think they had not fully understood before. That taking from the capable one to give to the one who is struggling does not actually help the one who is struggling. It just moves the instability around. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is let consequences arrive where they belong. I am not going to tell you I felt nothing when Callaway Street sold. I felt something. I felt the specific grief of a thing that should have gone differently going the way it actually went, which is its own kind of loss distinct from injustice. But I also felt standing in my house in Raleigh, with Fletcher asleep on the couch and the evening light coming through windows that look out on a yard that is mine, that I was exactly where I was supposed to be, built on a foundation that was solid because I had laid it correctly, with documentation and intention and the help of people who showed up when it mattered. That is the thing about revenge when it comes through the law and through truth and through your own work. It does not feel like winning. It feels like being restored to what you were owed. And that feeling, quieter than triumph, steadier than satisfaction, is the one that actually lasts. So I want to ask you one more thing before I go. Is there someone in your life right now who is being told that their capability is a reason to overlook what they are owed? Share this video with them, not as a warning, not to frighten them, but to show them that someone else came through it and built something real on the other side. Because that is what this community is for. That is what the Revenge Diaries is for. Stories that help people feel less alone in the hard things and more certain that the hard things can be survived. Like this video, subscribe if you are not already here. Share it with someone who needs it. And drop a comment below. Tell me what you would have done on that porch. Tell me what you would have done when you read that note. I read every single comment in this community, and I will be in there this week. I will see you in the next one.